All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Hope everybody is doing well. Apologies for a short delay here as far as the schedule goes. Let me just get some light going on. That's odd. My light is not working correctly, but that's fine. We're going to go here. Quick YouTube issue. Let me make sure that's not working incorrectly. Can you guys hear me? I hope you guys are hearing me okay. I want to make sure that we don't have tech issues going on here. Getting some very weird problems on the YouTube side here. Let's see. Hopefully we're okay. I'm trying to access the chat here, but it's not even loading up correctly. All right, that should be good. Okay, you guys can hear me? Excellent. Welcome. Thank you, everybody. Apologies for the delay and slight tech issues, but we are here. We are here. We've got light. We've got everything that we need. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate everybody in the chat. Thank you. Apologies for the short delay and the tech issues going on here. I'm not sure what was going on, but at least you guys can hear me and see me now. So as you may have gathered from the slides that are currently on the screen, this week is going to be a little bit different to normal. There's still going to be some of the same sort of stuff that we do, a lot of drills, trainer work, things like that. But today I really want to focus some energy on the idea of how to actually study effectively. I'm just going to make sure that there's no background noise here in my office. Got my server running some sims, but we're going to shut that off. So the idea of how to study is something that comes up time and time again. It really consistently is something that I get asked about. It's something that we get questions about on Discord. And it's one of the things that kind of becomes the hardest part of the early stages, the early stages of the poker learning process. So when we're in that beginning phase, when we're really trying to get the most out of the tools that we have, the resources that we have, we tend to run into some barriers. We tend to run into things that maybe are harder to figure out, things that, study processes that are harder to implement. So what we want is to have ideas in mind, principles in mind that we can fall back on that are going to be reliable and can help us to build the processes that are actually going to be effective. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, the first thing that we're going to look at is a comparison or a guide to the concept of broad versus deep study approaches. So the two sort of contrasting philosophies of how we go about approaching, figuring out a spot or figuring out, what do I need to learn and so on. Then we've got the idea of finding the why. This is something that we get asked about again repeatedly. Any player who's studying with solvers has kind of experienced the idea that it's quite tricky sometimes to figure out why the solver is doing a certain thing, or if I made a mistake in the trainer, why was it a mistake, right? That is something that we actually have to spend a lot of time looking into, and it's something that's easy to feel like it's not there, it's not contained within the tools. The tools are not explaining things in the right way, but the why is there if you look for it, and I'll tell you about that when we get to that point. We're then going to talk a little bit about practical application, how we might apply some of these ideas in real contexts. We're going to go through the idea of a feedback loop and why that's one of the most important fundamental aspects of coaching or of any kind of study process. And we're going to talk a little bit about just a bit of advice for how to review hand histories in a way that's actually effective and produces some kind of development for you going forward. So to kick off, let's talk about broad versus deep study approaches. And this is something that is, I think, particularly relevant for anybody who is right at that beginning point of not really knowing, anytime you're sitting down to come study poker, what sort of approach would I take? What sort of approach is going to actually make the most difference for me as a player? Because there really is more than one philosophy here. There's more than one way that you can advance your understanding in a meaningful fashion. And I think some players are pretty guilty of only using one of these methods or only going in one direction, when in fact they would benefit a lot more from a mix of both. So what does this mean? Well, there's really these two approaches of going broad and going deep. It hinges on the idea that you can't study everything all at once, right? You can't figure out, you can't look at the whole game tree. You can't study every single every single potential spot and also study them all in detail. You pretty much have to pick between, for any given study session, not for overall, but just for any individual study session, you have to pick between comparing a lot of different spots and improving your surface level understanding, your pattern recognition of, usually in these types of spots, we tend to do this, this, or this, versus deep diving one specific spot and really getting greater insight into some of the micro level concepts. So this is really a question of, are we studying the macro or are we studying the micro? Because you can't really study both at the same time. We're either picking between looking for surface level, big picture understanding, general perspective on certain types of spots, or we're looking for a more granular understanding of the specifics of an individual situation. And that pattern recognition alone from the big picture knowledge that we might gain, it can't build your entire skill set. You can't have an entire poker repertoire that is purely built off just recognizing all the patterns. Players often talk about, how are we supposed to memorize all these spots? Or how are you supposed to understand or know or study all of these different spots that exist? The answer is, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to rely purely on pattern recognition. You will see, if you look at some of the episodes of GTO Duel that we've been filming, if you look at the way Stephen Chidwick makes decisions in those situations and the way that he breaks down a spot in the trainer, he's not always relying on a previous hand that he studied or having studied a certain situation in great detail. He's building strategies in real time based off of understanding the principles. And that comes from identifying what those principles are, going deep into specific situations and extracting an understanding of how certain concepts work at the micro level that you can then apply to other situations. So this is the key sort of dilemma that we face every time we're going to go study. And we have to kind of pick between one of these things and the other when we're trying to put in place a study routine or a study session. Because if you don't go into a study session with a goal, if you don't say, my goal this session is I'm focused on macro stuff, I'm focused on micro stuff, you're not really going to take a lot away from it. So to give you an example of how these things work in an actual study context, let's say we're logging into Octopi, and let's say I decide that I want to study a situation in a more broad sense, right? I'm just going to refresh the page here because the font's gone all weird for some reason. Chad says build heuristics equals win. See, that's kind of the mistake that a lot of players do, is that they try to build a heuristic for every single situation, and there's no amount of heuristics that you're ever going to be that you're ever going to be able to have that are going to cover every single situation. So it's not about heuristics purely. The heuristics covers the pattern recognition part of it, but you have to be able to do deep dives and understand the specific factors that are contributing to individual hands or ranges wanting to play in certain ways by doing those deep dives. So let's say, for example, I wanted to get a broad understanding of, let's say, 3-bet ranges at 30 big blinds, right? Well, one tool I can use for this is the comparison tool here. So I can go into 8 max, MTT, even stacks, compare ranges, right? So let's say I wanted to get a general perspective on my 3-bet ranges at 30 bigs. Well, we've got the opening ranges all sort of picked out there already, but we don't just want to look at hero being in the big blind. We want to look at, let's say we're actually going to put hero in, we're going to put villain in under the gun 8, but it's going to serve as the hero here. And we're going to look at all of the positions facing under the gun 8 here. And we're just going to look at 30 big blinds. So we're not actually comparing it with another stack. We're just looking at the surface level trends as far as how the ranges are constructed. And I'm going to go with a vertical display here so I can just scroll down through the positions. What I can see immediately from the first set of ranges here, right, is that there's a specific portion of the deck, specific portion of hands that doesn't 3-bet at this stack size. Ace queen suited, ace jack suited, king queen suited, right? Against under the gun. We never 3-bet those hands in this formation. Then we've also got, same position here, or same concept here in the low jack versus under the gun 8. Is it the same in the hijack? Yes, it is. Very same sort of trend. Is it the same in the cutoff? In fact, it even expands. There's a specific region of hands that doesn't 3-bet here, right? Then you've got the button. It gets even wider. There's a more specific region of hands that never 3-bets. So if I wanted to go deeper into that trend, I would start to say, okay, well, how does that differ from maybe 60 big blinds? Maybe I include 60 big blinds in this framework, and then I say, let's hide the RFI. So now I can compare 30 big blinds and 60 big blinds. And I can start to say, okay, well, at 60, king queen suited is 3-betting some, ace jack suited is 3-betting some, ace queen suited is 3-betting a tiny bit. And is that the same here again from low jack against under the gun 8? Yeah, it kind of is, or at least it's fairly close. Then we've got from hijack. Well, that's not the same. Now these hands are still always flatting at 60, right? So you can start to take a note of some of these trends that occur and just on a macro level, understand what the general shape of our range is. Is there going to be a region of hands that doesn't want to 3-bet? Are we going to see changes in frequencies? So for example, frequency here of 3-betting here is at 6%, and then from low jack is at 6%, hijack is at 6%, cutoff 5%, button 6%. So really no substantial change there, right? From one position to another. The position of the open raiser is going to be a more important variable here than what position we're in. So ultimately, that's a pretty good trend for you to be able to notice, right? So right away, if you were going to study at a macro level, you'd be able to see these trends, see that there's one factor that maybe doesn't really change very much according to our position, and we can start to develop some more ideas from there. So this is that pattern recognition, but it's also, if we were going to go into the deeper methodology, if we were going to go deep instead of broad here, what we might do is say, okay, well, let me examine in an individual spot here, what is it that I think is contributing to, let's say, ace queen suited never 3-betting, right? What would it be potentially that could cause this hand to want to play this way? And to do that, maybe I look at the response against the 3-bet, and we hide the single raise pot here, and we start to look at what the original raiser would do if we do 3-bet, because that's going to give us a sense of where some of the benefits and drawbacks are going to come for an individual hand. So good example here would be, as you can see, if under the gun 7 3-bets ace queen suited, well, king queen off is going to fold, ace jack off is going to fold, ace 10 off is going to fold, queen jack off is going to fold, queen 9 suited is going to fold. So that's already quite a big downside for ace queen suited. So on a micro level, when we're studying for depth, we can start to pick out small factors like that as well. You can start to pick out individual situations, individual hands, combos, portions of our range that make sense to play in a certain way because of those micro level factors. So to go back to the slides here, we're going broad and we're looking at macro factors, or we're going deep and we're looking at micro factors. We're not looking at both. If you try to look at both, you're going to end up getting very confused. Welcome, Olyao Gajo. Thank you for being here again. Keep trying to pronounce your name correctly. So this is the first aspect. This is the first part of the process here as far as how we approach setting up a study session, study plan, anything like that. Second part, this is the slide for the example. I got ahead of myself here. The second part here is finding the why. Now this is, again, the question that we always get asked. What is the why? What are the reasons why the solver does a certain thing? And in this case, we already showed a little bit of some of the investigation of the why, right? The investigation of, let's say, that ace queen suited situation here. And if we want to talk about this in a bit more detail, it's important to remember that the solver is not a black box. The solver is not something where the answers are unclear or where the answers are unknown. It's not it's not using a sort of mysterious methodology. It's using a very specific methodology. The solver doesn't know itself why it does specific things. It's just math. It's just brute forcing its way to the best strategy. But we can definitely identify trends, we can identify logic, and we can speculate with some degree of accuracy about why certain things happen the way that they do. So anytime we're looking at why, the crucial element here is that the reason why always hinges on what the response strategy is from other players, whether it's the original raiser, whether it's your post flop and your heads up and it's the other player, whatever it is, the response strategy is why a strategy looks the way it does. So, for example, if we go back to this comparison tool, instead of using the comparison tool, let's just use the basic pre-flop viewer here. If we want to try to think about 30 big blinds, let's say we get hijack open here, and then let's say look at the small blind, right? Because small blind here has some shoves, they have some non-all-in 3-bets, they have some calls, and they have some folds. So pretty complex strategy. So if we want to start to figure out why these different parts of this strategy look the way that they do, if we want to ask why might something like King 10 suited be shoving here? Why is King 10 suited a pure shove from the small blind, right? If we're trying to answer that question, we have to look at the response. So what does the hijack do when the small blind shoves with this hand, right? This is the big blind's response, but this is the hijack's response. And if you look, you can start to really clearly see some of the factors that generate EV for King 10 suited. First of all, of course, the hijack is calling with some pocket pairs that King 10 suited is flipping against, which is not a bad thing. Then King Queen off is folding, King Jack off is folding, King 10 off is folding, Ace 10 off is folding. A bunch of other ace highs are folding that maybe aren't dominated but are still ahead. So there's a ton of benefit here that King 10 suited is capturing from shoving there, because not only is it going to be able to fold out a lot of better hands, but also it's going to be able to flip against a lot of the hands that do call. So right away, we can immediately see some benefit there. We can immediately see some of the potential logic that's going on here. Now, Queen Jack suited is not shoving here. And we might think, okay, well, if King 10 suited is shoving, but Queen Jack suited isn't, why is that going to be the case? So we might ask a bit more about why that hand might not want to take that line. Well, it could certainly have a lot to do with the fact that King Jack suited is calling here, right? And it also probably has a lot to do with the fact that Ace Jack off is calling. Because if we shove King 10 suited, then, we don't really care that much if Ace Jack off calls, because we're still very live against that hand. But if we shove Queen Jack suited and Ace Jack off calls, that's really bad. That's a very bad situation for us. So you can start to see these patterns, you can start to see these trends if you look at the responses. And the key thing to remember here is that every decision everywhere in the game tree, every single decision is made in some capacity because it keeps opponents indifferent between options. It keeps them in a position where they have tough decisions that they're faced with, right? There's nothing that goes on in a GTO solution that isn't based off of indifference in some capacity. It is the concept that holds the entire game of poker together. Each player is trying to make sure that the other player does not have a clear adaptation that they can make that is higher EV. So if you focus on that concept, you're going to be able to figure out the why in more detail. If you're looking at a spot in the trainer and you come across a mistake and you try to think, well, why is this a mistake? The answer is going to be in some capacity because it's not keeping your opponent indifferent. If you make a mistake, it's because your opponent is not going to be as likely to be indifferent against that line. So this is where the why comes from. When you're trying to figure out the why, these are the approaches that we have to take. Now, we've talked a little bit about the example here. Going back to it here, we've got this 30 big blind situation. We can apply the same logic to post flop. We can start to look at, let's say, any random post flop spot here. Let's just go under the gun button. Let's say random flop. So this flop is 766. The reason why the under the gun player is going to take the strategy that they're taking here, which in this case is they're either betting 50% or checking. The reason why they're doing this is because it keeps the button indifferent at the highest rate. It creates indifference at the highest frequency here. So the B50 size is going to put a lot of these hands in awkward spots. You can see like King Queen off, King Jack off is being targeted here, Ace 10 off, a lot of hands that are going to have ambiguous decisions versus this bet size. And that specifically is going to create indifference for the opposing player. Same thing goes for the checking range. If the under the gun player checks, the button now has tough decisions about whether to bet with certain hands or not, right? They don't always want to just bet every good hand here, but they also don't want to check too much. So they're forced to kind of balance and mix certain hands, and that creates indifference for them as well. So the why is always related to that concept of indifference. And if we wanted to try to find a weird spot and figure out why it looks so weird, well, let's just focus on some different lines, right? Let's just kind of look at some unusual lines here. So let's say check, bet, raise. This is, okay, so this is a good example, right? This is the button here is actually shoving all in on the flop against a check raise sometimes, right? The button is occasionally shoving some hands in this spot, which in this case is mostly an overpair. So eights through jacks, and then a flush draw a lot of the time, right? That's by far the bulk of the shoving range here, overpairs and flush draws. So if that's the case, we have to figure out how is that keeping the check raising range indifferent. So we look at the response. If we look at the response, you can see that there's a lot of hands here that are actually in quite an awkward spot because ace high, king high, a lot of these hands that have, for example, flush draws are in some pretty awkward scenarios. Even some of the ones that don't have flush draws, even something like ace king no flush draw, is in a tough spot here versus a shove because it is beating some of those flush draws, but it's also losing to the overpairs. So there's always some element of indifference going on there. Tyler, welcome. We always talk about keeping our opponent indifferent. When we look at their response to an action we should look into hand classes we're targeting to be mixing fold. Yeah, absolutely right. Mixing fold instead of pure fold. And yeah, from a bluffing aspect, which is why we use the word fold. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is very clearly, that is the best way to go here. We want to think about what classes of hands we're going to be targeting with any given option. And like I say, the why is in there. The why is always in there somewhere. You just have to be able to figure out what the principle is that is called into action here. And in most cases, it's indifference, and how you're keeping the opponent indifferent by taking that action. So this is how we find the why. Now, in terms of practical application, this is where things get quite tricky because obviously taking these solver strategies and applying them in real environments is not simple. It's not a straightforward process because these are very complicated strategies. But that doesn't mean they're not applicable. It doesn't mean that we somehow have to throw everything out the window when we come up against real human opponents. So to start off, of course, we're very aware that humans don't play exactly like the solver. We know that, right? Nobody is trying to say that humans do play exactly like the solver. But the crucial part here is in some spots, they can get surprisingly close, sometimes without even trying. It is possible for a human to play relatively close to GTO, even accidentally. So for example, a 5 big blind all-in shove from a recreational player. They might accidentally end up being pretty close to GTO there if they shove for 5 big blinds. There are actually quite a lot of ICM situations where an opponent can kind of accidentally fall into being appropriately tight in a certain situation, and they end up calling off with approximately the right range just because they're naturally playing very tight, right? So it's not always the case that we can just throw the solver out the window because we do need somewhere to start from, and we do need somewhere to go when we're up against an opponent where we actually think that even if they don't know about GTO, they can still surprisingly get close to a GTO response. So we always want to try to identify what we think the specific differences are between the solver and how different types of human opponents would play a spot. So to go back to the example that we just have, well, actually, let's just use this example right here, right? So in terms of a specific example that we might be seeing, well, let's think about that shove on the flop, right? If we check raise this flop against a small bet, how might we respond against a real human when it comes to this particular scenario? Well, one thing that we probably can identify right away in terms of what a real human might do is it's quite unlikely or uncommon that a player will actually be taking these overpair hands and mixing shoves and calls. Most human opponents are either going to shove these hands or they're going to call these hands. They're not likely to actually mix So what that's going to do is, even if they play the rest of their range exactly the same way as the solver, at a baseline level, it's going to, if they are shoving these overpairs more often, if they're playing pure shove with them, it's going to heavily increase the density of those overpairs in their shoving range. So they're going to have more shoving hands that are fairly strong and fewer flush draws, which is going to mean that the equity of our range against that shove is going to go down because they have more made hands, fewer draws, and so on. Now, by contrast, if we thought that they were never shoving these hands and they were only shoving the flush draws, well, now the equity of our range against that shove goes way up, and we might start to call it off with hands that previously would not have called it off. So if we look at the specific differences and we start to extrapolate how that's going to incentivize us when it comes to the approach that we take against that range, we can start to fill in the gaps a little bit and figure out reasonable differences in how these aspects are going to alter our strategy. And this is one of the crucial aspects that goes into playing exploitatively in any context, right? It's figuring out exactly what portions of our range are going to have the incentive to change how we're actually playing. When it comes to the later streets, this is even more pronounced. If we look at situations where we're facing a river bet, facing a river shove, for example, the indifferent hands, the bluff catching hands, those are the ones that we're going to have the incentive to either always call or always fold based on how we think an actual human opponent is playing. So you want to think about, in the same way that we were thinking about the indifferent hands when we're building our strategy and we're trying to figure out why it looks the way it does, we also want to think about when we're the player who's facing aggression, or when we're the player who's facing a human opponent that we think is playing differently from the solver, how might we alter the way we play those indifferent hands based on the idea or the assumption that they are no longer indifferent, right? So that is one of the key variables that's going to change there when we're playing against real opponents. And in general, if you start to build an approach here where whenever you look at a sim, whenever you're, let's say you're going broad and you're trying to think about in general across all of these types of situations, how am I going to play or how am I supposed to play, you might start to add that you might start to add this element into that layer where you're thinking about, if I'm going broad, but I'm also applying a practical assumption there, how might I play this general category of situations against the average player in my player pool? So you're looking at player pool tendencies, but you're looking in a macro way. Alternatively, you might do what we just did, which is to look at a very micro level spot and take a look at how you think the tendencies of the player pool are going to influence that specific run out, that specific board texture, and really go very deep into that circumstance and try to think a little bit about how you're choosing your ranges differently against a different type of opponent or against a human opponent that plays according to a certain kind of blueprint. So you can apply this theoretical, practical aspect, this sort of division there, with the broad versus deep concept as well. Excuse me. Sorry, I thought I was about to sneeze. Hit the mute button and we did not sneeze, so that's fine. All right, so from here, obviously we've talked a little bit about that practical application. Let's now talk a little bit about feedback loops. And this is where we start to get into the territory where the sim library here is going to be less useful. So I'm probably not going to be going into an example for this one, but feedback loops are an incredibly important concept in the improvement process, because what a lot of players are lacking is the ability to run kind of iterations of their thought process the same way that the solver would. They're not getting that feedback. They're not getting any kind of input as to how accurate or how well-rounded their thought process was. And as a result, they're not able to build that loop that allows them to actually consistently improve. So your study process, bottom line, even if it's this YouTube channel, which I hope is your favorite YouTube channel, your study process cannot just be you and your favorite YouTube channel. It can't be. There has to be a feedback loop somewhere. There has to be some kind of reinforcement that you're getting, whether it is you and the solver, you and a coach, you and other players. Anything that allows you to build that loop is going to be better than having no feedback loop whatsoever. And if you lack access to these resources, if you don't, for example, you don't have a membership to a site that allows you to access solver sims or a trainer, you don't have a coach, you don't have other poker players that you talk to, poker friends, whatever it is, getting access to these resources is non-negotiable in your development process. You simply are not going to actually develop your game just by only watching videos and not doing any kind of active study or practical study. There needs to be that feedback loop. But there's plenty of flexibility in how you actually manage that feedback loop. If you're working with solver tools like Octopi, you can put in place a loop where when you're running a sim in the trainer, and in fact, we actually can use an example for this. I didn't think we were going to use an example, but we can. When you're running a spot in the trainer, you can build that feedback loop around any instance where you make some kind of a mistake. So let's say we go to the trainer, and let's say we build a drill. I'm just going to hit a random drill, save and train, totally random drill here. Let's say that I make a mistake. Right now I'm going to raise ace king here. Hopefully I get 3-bet and I'll make some kind of a mistake. Okay, so whatever. Let's make a mistake here on the flop, right? It's a mistake to check here, I would think. So let's make a mistake. Oh, it's not a mistake to check. There is a tiny frequency of check. Okay, so let's play this hand again, and I'm gonna go big bet on the flop because I know that's a mistake, right? So let's say I went big bet on the flop. Yeah, 0% mistake. So very small mistake, but we made a mistake. So what I would do here is say, okay, I want to build a little mini feedback loop around this mistake. So I need to either do one of 2 or 3 things. I can either take a screenshot of this situation and send it to my coach, which is what I do a lot with my own students, have them screenshot mistakes that they make. We talk about it, we explain it. I can post it on the Octopi Discord, post it somewhere where I talk with my poker friends, poker players that I know. I can get some feedback on why is this a mistake, or what do we think is the reasoning or the logic here. Or I can simply consult the solver. So I can say, okay, well, let's make the right play, or let's make the play that the solver does like here. And then let's build this loop by now checking what the sim does on the flop, right? We can actually look at the flop sim and say, okay, this is what my strategy is. I'm going to take some notes. I'm going to take some notes about what I thought was happening and why I thought that maybe, in this case, it was a big bet, why I thought this was a big bet flop. Turns out it's not. What are the variables that I was wrong about? What are the aspects that I didn't get right? And then we're going back into the trainer and we're continuing from this point, having taken a couple of notes about some of the aspects of our thought process that might have actually been a little bit off. So one way or another, we're building that feedback loop here, even if we just have the solver and the tools themselves as the source of that feedback. There has to be a loop though. There has to be a loop somewhere, and it is non-negotiable to build one. You can't do it all on your own. So with that said, let's now look at our last topic here, which is reviewing hands. Now, once we're done with this topic, I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. So if you have anything that you're curious about, do drop the questions in chat and I will tackle them after the end of this topic in the next 5 or 10 minutes. The last topic here is reviewing hands, right? How to actually review hand histories in a way that teaches you things and allows you to build that feedback loop in a meaningful way, as opposed to just not really learning anything, not really taking anything away. Well, there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind. First of all, when you are reviewing a hand, it's really important that you only consider the information that you actually had access to at the time you played the hand. So not results, not consequences, so busting out of the tournament, anything that happened as a result of playing the hand. Obviously, you didn't know that was going to happen when you played the hand. So all of that is totally irrelevant. In fact, it's generally a good idea to not tell anybody the results of the situation if you're sending them the hand, right? If you are sending a hand to a coach, another player, friend, whatever, don't tell them I busted on this hand. Just tell them the hand and let their feedback be as unbiased as possible. Instead of telling them I busted in this spot, can I get away from kings in this spot or something like that, right? That's going to bias the results quite a bit. So that's the starting point. The second thing is to seek feedback from multiple sources wherever possible. Don't just consult the solver, but try to consult the solver and a coach, the solver and a friend, something like that. Your coach and a friend if you don't have a solver, whatever it is. Seek feedback from multiple sources, because that feedback loop is going to become more complex and more advanced if you have multiple sources that are involved in it. You're putting in more iterations on that loop and you're getting more accurate feedback, more diverse feedback based on asking multiple people about the same hands. Now, The other thing is that a lot of your reviewed hands should be hands that you actually win. If you are only reviewing hands that you lose, you're going to be incredibly biased in your assumptions and your evaluations of your play. You should be reviewing hands that you win. You should be reviewing situations where maybe even nothing interesting or nothing particularly consequential actually happens. But those are going to be some of the spots where you're actually going to pick up information about potential blind spots that might exist for you. So it certainly should be the case that reviewing hands should happen with hands that you actually win. And then finally, it's also very crucial to recognize that the ideas that you have looking back on the hand after having played it are not the same as what you were actually thinking when you played it, because you can never have 20/20 vision on that. You can never actually repeat that thought process in game or from in game, because when you're in game, you have a certain amount of cognitive load going on and a certain amount of reaction to that immediate decision pressure going on that you can't replicate away from the table. You can't cause that same feeling to exist. You can't really create the same effect. So it's important to recognize you're always going to have some element of inaccuracy as far as what you were actually thinking in real time. And as a result, the closer in time you can post the hand or send the hand to somebody or review the hand, the more accurate you're going to be. The further you get away from the actual hand in terms of time, the less accuracy you're going to have in terms of your memory of what you were thinking in real time. So that means posting a hand right after you play it. It means posting a hand the next day, something like that, later that day after your session. It doesn't mean you wait a week and then you send 5 hands to somebody and now you don't really have the ability to have a coherent or a well-rounded discussion about it as much anymore. So this is how we actually turn hand history processing into something that we can really learn from. It doesn't require just taking a hand and running it through the solver every time. That can be part of it, but the feedback loop is more complex than that. Like I say, you need to build that loop in a way that requires or involves multiple different sources of information. And overall, you want that loop to be as rapid as possible. You want it to be that you are getting feedback quite quickly after you play the hand, not waiting a week, waiting 2 weeks, whatever it is, because you're just going to forget stuff. So that is the process of reviewing hands and how it connects to all these other parts of the process. So I'm happy to take any questions if you guys have them. I know this is a lot of information just kind of bombarding you here, but this session is going to serve pretty well, I think, as an overall guide to what we want to be looking at, what we want to be thinking about when we're building our study process. And I think another thought that I would leave you with here that I didn't put on the slides, but I do think it's important, is to recognize that poker is not the poker development process is not a skill building process in the same way that when you're learning let's say a specific physical skill, a sport or something like that. It's not just a question of you build up the skill, you build it up, and then you have it forever, right? Poker is a lot more like learning a language. I've always talked, for any of you who've seen a lot of my content, I talk a lot about the relationship between learning poker and learning a language because I'm from a languages background. I studied French in college, have a degree in French and also some linguistics in there. Also I have a master's in transnational studies, a lot of sociolinguistics and stuff like that in there. So I come from a languages background, and there is so much overlap between how players learn poker effectively and how players learn or how people learn languages. I prefer to treat poker a lot more like learning a new language, where if you don't use it, it doesn't develop. If you don't put it into practice, it doesn't develop. And there isn't a way to just sort of stay in private and just study everything and then just come out of your shell, come out of your study process, and you just know everything, and then you can just implement it going forward. It's a dynamic process. It requires repetition, reinforcement, and you're never going to be perfect at it. Even if you are in the same way that as an adult, if you learn a language as an adult, you can never get to the same level of competence as a native speaker. It's the same with poker. Nobody's really a native speaker in poker, right? No player out there is so well versed in poker that they have that level of basically being a native speaker. But if you keep focusing on reinforcing things over time and you keep learning in the way that a language learner would, then it's going to head you in the right direction. So David Stern says, can you go over figuring out what you did wrong on a hand again, please? Yeah, sure. So the first thing is when reviewing a hand, consider only the information you actually had access to at the time you played the hand, not the results or the consequences. So what you did wrong, you may not have done anything wrong, right? This is the crucial thing, right? It's very important, and I didn't mention this before, but I should have. It's very important that you don't look at the results and say, I lost this hand. What did I do wrong? Because the fact that you lost the hand is completely disconnected from anything that you did wrong or right. The fact that you lost the hand is just the results. It is variance, and what you did wrong or right is what happens during the hand, not what happens after it. Then, of course, we have to seek feedback from multiple sources, not just one. We have to make sure that we are reviewing hands that we win, hands that we lose, various different types of hands. And we have to recognize that we don't have full clarity on what it was we were actually thinking in game. But if we can review the hand quite close to when we actually played it, we can start to get more of a sense of what we were thinking and then correlate that with maybe what was the right way to think about it or what was better. So, 12-week plan, are we supposed to join? Or, I mean, the 12-week plan is something that's simply going to happen in the coaching sessions here, and it's going to be on the Discord in the drills as well. So, as far as the launch process goes, next week's session here on YouTube is going to serve as the intro session for that. It's going to serve as the welcome call. As far as whether or not you sign up, if you're already an Octopi member, you're going to have access to this. Like, this is not something that you have to separately sign up for. This is not something that the average Octopi member is not going to have access to. It is designed for the first 2 months to include or to be designed for use of the personal subscription, and then the final month is going to be the professional with a lot of ICM spots. But basically, this is just going to be something that we put in place on YouTube. So you're going to see the intro session next week, and we're going to keep kind of fleshing out a lot of these key concepts in these sessions going forward. So the next 12 weeks after that are really going to be giving you guys everything that you need prior to the summer, hopefully, so you guys can go out and take some bracelets down. Where are we at? So Tom Hopkins, welcome Tom, says confused on why it said check was correct. If so, I'm not sure. Maybe you're on like you're rewinding the stream. Like maybe you're looking at something from earlier in the stream. I'm not sure exactly which spot you're talking about there. It might be maybe the ace king hand. If it is the ace king hand, then it could simply be that it was just mixing. So bear in mind that, you know, a correct decision is going to be any decision that is taken at some frequency in a GTO strategy. It's just going to be something that's not a mistake. And there's, of course, going to be multiple correct decisions in many spots. So, could be wrong. Thought I saw that. Yeah, again, I'm not exactly sure where you're referring to there. So if you're lagging behind on the stream a little bit, you know, you might not see this until later, but that's fine. So guys, I think unless there's any more questions coming in, you guys did mention wanting to have a session like this. So I'm glad that we've been able to get through some of this content. I do want to continue, you know, talking about some of these ideas going forward for sure. We'll cover some of them in the intro session for the 12-week course that's coming up. But thanks, and we are going to see each other next week, of course, as usual. If there's no other questions coming in, I think we'll probably wrap it here. But thanks to everybody for being here. I will be on the Discord if any of you guys have specific questions, of course, about the study process. And I hope you guys will take a lot away from this as far as how you build your study processes going forward, and how you take the right approaches and take the right philosophy into your study process, similar to a lot of what I do and a lot of what a lot of other pros do, of course, as well. So thank you, everybody. I think that is a good spot to wrap it for today. I will see you guys next week. Good luck in the meantime. Look forward to starting the 12-week course with all of you. And of course, in the meantime, best of luck, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.